Welcome to rePROs Fight Back, a podcast where we explore all things reproductive health, rights, and justice. I'm your host, Jenny Wetter, and I'll be helping you stay informed around issues like birth control, abortion, sex education, and LGBTQ issues, and much, much more. Giving you the tools you need to take action and fight back. Okay, let's dive in. Hi, rePROs. I'm your host, Jenny Wetter, and my preferred pronouns are she, her. So this week we got great news, well, mostly great news, in that we finally got the Supreme Court decision in June Medical Services, and we won. I was so worried that we would not win, and it should have been like an obvious answer since it had just come up before the court 4 years ago, but I didn't have faith. But we won. But unfortunately, that is not the case we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the case that was decided immediately before June Medical, and that's on the Anti-Prostitution loyalty oath. And that was a case we lost. Don't worry, we'll talk about June as soon as I can connect with Julie again, and we will have that conversation, hopefully this week, but it's coming soon. Don't worry. So, I'm just going to take a minute to talk about, thinking of the great win in June Medical, it's important to say it is a win and we need to celebrate it, but it just means that things aren't going to get worse right this second, right? Unfortunately, that doesn't mean that all of a sudden everybody has access to abortion services. So many people already were struggling to either access care because of barriers like 24-hour waiting periods or having to travel really far to a clinic or can't afford it. This doesn't change any of that. It just means that it's not going to get exponentially worse today. So, we need to keep fighting to ensure that people who need access to abortion are able to access it and that it's affordable, and really fight to ensure that those vulnerable populations who already have a disproportionate lack of access to care, so low-income individuals, LGBTQI community, young people, Black people, are able to access the care they need. And those are the people we need to be centering in this fight to ensure that they have access to services. We'll talk about all that more with June. And again, that's not the one we're going to talk about today. So, this week I am really excited to think about Hamilton coming out on Disney+. I am so excited, y'all. I'm really excited to see it again, and I don't think I've ever told the story, and if I have, sorry. So I was really lucky, and I was able to see Hamilton on Broadway, and I've seen it in DC too, but I was able to see it on Broadway as well, and so this was like 4 years ago around my birthday. I just happened to be on Twitter or something at night, and I saw a tweet from the Hamilton account saying there was a new block of tickets going up at 9:00, and it was like 8:58. I was like, oh my God, let me get my wallet. And so I scrambled, and I was able to get tickets. And I wasn't able to get tickets till November, but whatever, I got tickets. I just picked a random night, got tickets, and was that was my birthday present to myself. And I was so excited. So fast forward, I meet a friend for dinner, and we're walking to the theater, and we get to the theater, and this motorcade pulls up. I'm like, okay. Oh man, I really hope it's not like Trump or something, because I think I forgot to say it was 4 years ago. So this was November 2016. It was right after the election. And so I get into the theater, and I'm sitting down, and some young people behind me start talking, and they're all excited. Mostly young girls. They're all excited because the vice president is here. And I was like, oh my goodness, I'm at the show with Joe Biden. How amazing is that? I was so excited. And then I hear them keep talking, and they're like, yeah, Pence is here. And I was like, huh. And all I could think was, don't say what you want to say. Don't turn around and tell them. 1, he's the vice president-elect. And 2, as women who are women-presenting people who have need for reproductive health care, you should not be excited. No, there's nothing to be excited about that Pence is here. So this show, Hamilton, you know it's amazing, period. But going on that night, it was lightning in a bottle. So what you hear reported often is that the crowd booed Pence. And I mean, obviously, I booed. I mean, he's someone who gets up every day fighting against everything I get up fighting for. So yes, I booed and no regrets. And then you hear about the amazing speech that the cast gave at the end, which was magical. But less covered is the whole show felt like a protest. You know, the show uses a lot of revolutionary language and like a lot of things that I think, get like big cheers on a normal night. Just the crowd was electrified and so was the cast. And we all used it as a moment to make our voices heard. And it was so cathartic to be able to do it with him there. So, everything, like it was so great and lightning in a bottle. So I know I will never relive the magic of that particular show, but I'm really excited to see it again because it was really magical that night. And yeah, I don't really know what else to say about it other than it was really something I needed after the week before, which was the election. So it was a lot of fun. And so that is the memory I always have when I think of Hamilton, was being there that night to get to voice my concerns, and whether that's, cheering my head off when Angelica talks about including women in the sequel for the Declaration of Independence or any other things. It felt good to do it and to have him hear how excited we were, and then to have the cast give such an amazing speech directly to him about the need to represent all of us, the diverse people in America. It felt good. So with that, let's turn to this week's episode. And I am really excited to have Kiefer Buckingham on. She is with the Open Societies Foundations and the Open Society Policy Center. She is amazing, and it was a great interview, and I can't wait for you all to hear it. Hi, Kiefer. Thank you so much for being here today.
Hi, Jenny. It's so great to be with you.
I am so excited to have you on. It's been way too long without having you.
It really has. I'm obviously a huge fan of the show. And since I'm back from parental leave, now we can finally get down to it.
So, Kiefer, can you take a quick second and introduce yourself, including your pronouns?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Kiefer Buckingham. I use she, her pronouns. I am a senior policy advisor in Washington, D.C. for the Open Society Foundations and the Open Society Policy Center.
Okay, so there's a lot going on, and like the big news yesterday, I guess Monday, because this will probably come out on Wednesday, it was the June medical services, but that wasn't the only important rePRO Supreme Court decision yesterday.
Right. I mean, I think it took a lot of the space up, and rightfully so. Rightfully so.
But I guess before we get to the case, we haven't talked about the anti-prostitution pledge very much at all on the podcast, kind of only in passing. So I think it's a good time to do some level set. So what is the anti-prostitution loyalty oath?
Right. So this thing also has lots of names. So maybe we can quickly say what we're going to call it this show, because I think that's helpful.
Yes.
We're going to call it the APLO because that's easier, right? So the APLO is the Anti-Prostitution Loyalty Oath. By the way, prostitution is not our term. We are using it because, it happens to be in the policy. For the purposes of this conversation, we're going to say the word prostitution a lot, but that is because that's what's actually in policy. We'll kind of switch back and forth from sex workers and sex work and prostitution, but just noting that when we say prostitution, in this case, we're using that as a legal term, and that's what's in legislation. So I also want to just say that.
I think that is absolutely a good level set, because that is something we've been trying to be really intentional with on the podcast, is language.
Right. Obviously. I mean, the term is stigmatizing, and, it reflects, frankly, kind of the nature of the policy, right? It's old, it's outdated, which we'll get to later on. But the APLO is also known as the Anti-Prostitution Pledge. And in legal documents, for those of you nerds who want to like read through all the cases, it's also referred to as the pledge requirement or the policy requirement. So that's the thing that we're going to be talking about today. But at the very sort of basic level, the APLO is a provision in the United States Leadership Against HIV/AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria Act of 2003. So that's a total mouthful. But that is the piece of legislation that created PEPFAR, or the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. So I think a lot of your listeners are familiar with this program, especially those who are familiar with the kind of global reproductive health space. It really is this amazing program that the US government runs that spends billions of dollars each year on preventing and treating HIV, right? So that's the, again, very sort of short version. But included in that piece of legislation that created this program was this provision. And it essentially says that no funds may be used to promote or advocate the legalization or practice of prostitution or sex trafficking. So let's stop there. First of all, prostitution and sex trafficking, they put in the exact same line, right? Like, so I think a lot of folks out there, cringe at hearing something like that. So they're not the same thing, obviously. But the government frequently conflates the two. And I think we've talked about you have had folks on who have talked about some of that. And so it's super problematic at its very core. The other part of this law says that no funds may be used to provide assistance to any group or organization that does not have a policy explicitly opposing prostitution and sex trafficking. So again, super problematic. And then lastly, it sort of said that by accepting funds from the US government, an NGO or public international organization agrees that, and its subawardees agrees that it is opposed to the practices of prostitution and sex trafficking. So I'm going to pause there. It's like a lot to unpack. But essentially there's two pieces, right? One is that you can't use the funds to actually do anything to promote the legalization of, we would say sex work or sex trafficking. And then you have to explicitly say, right? You have to say that, oh, by the way, we oppose these things. So it's kind of ridiculous. There's lots of folks who would say, yeah, of course we oppose sex trafficking. Like, that's a bad thing. But they're in the same sentence as quote unquote prostitution. So this policy has been around since 2003. PEPFAR, this legislation, has been reauthorized 3 times since it was created in 2003. And this policy has been maintained each time it has been reauthorized. So it's been around since then. It has not been repealed. Lastly, there are a couple exceptions to this policy as to sort of who must abide by it. And as we'll talk about next, that includes U.S. organizations who receive, these specific PEPFAR funds. And it includes the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria, which is the largest kind of multilateral donor in the space around fighting HIV, the World Health Organization, and any other UN agencies. These multilateral agencies are only exempt from part of the policy. And that is the part that says that they have to explicitly have a statement opposing the practices of prostitution and sex trafficking. They still have to abide by the other part, which says that you can't use US funds to promote or advocate the legalization or practice of prostitution and sex trafficking. So that's a lot. Yeah, so that is the Anti-Prostitution Pledge, or APLO, in a nutshell.
So that is a lot. And to us, it might seem pretty logical, like why that is important when talking about HIV and AIDS prevention. But let's talk about it. How does this impact HIV/AIDS work?
Right. I mean, first of all, we know that has something to do with it because it was included only in this specific law. So to be clear, you've talked about global gag rule and other policies in this podcast before. This policy is only as it relates to the specific PEPFAR funds, right? So we're only talking about this policy as it applies to our fight against HIV globally, right? And to put it quite simply, it really negatively impacts our ability to fight HIV, right? And the policy literally hurts our work that we're trying to do and is frankly at odds with other, sort of stated goals that the US government has put out there and that Congress has put out there, right? Around reducing new infections, increasing access to care, and including sort of access to care for quote unquote key populations, which kind of means, in this case, we're talking about folks that are uniquely vulnerable to HIV and to the impacts of the epidemic. And that includes LGBTQI people and sex workers, right? So it's just super antithetical to the broader goals that we've set out for ourselves as a US government in fighting this epidemic globally. So on the ground, kind of what that means is that the APLO sort of forces groups to make this impossible choice, right? Do you sign the pledge and thus receive US money? And you kind of sort of abandon sex workers and their families because you're not allowed to do this work. And there's this kind of chilling effect that kind of keeps organizations from even interacting with and serving sex workers because they're afraid of losing their US funds. Or the flip side, you don't sign the pledge and you miss out on this very lucrative US government money for HIV. And at the end of the day, you know, the US remains the largest bilateral donor in the fight against HIV. So that's a lot of money we're talking about. And unfortunately, you know, in many places that are sort of hardest hit by the HIV pandemic, the US funded clinic may be the only game in town, you know, and I think that, and again, referring back to what we know about the global gag rule, you know, if there's that one clinic there that folks can go to access care, but if you're afraid that you're going to be stigmatized or discriminated against, you're not going to go to get that test or to get your ARVs or to pick up condoms, right? So that's really what we're talking about here. Research has shown that moral rejection and criminalization of sex work really does create an environment where sex workers are even more vulnerable to violence and to abuse, and therefore, consequently, at much greater risk of contracting HIV. So what I'm trying to say here is that this policy compounds and exacerbates kind of what already exists out there for sex workers, right? I mean, lack of access to care, you know, discrimination, stigma, and this US policy is making it worse, frankly. And the last thing I'll say is, you know, I used to work on Capitol Hill, and one of the things that members of Congress talk a lot about is outcomes, right? Like, what is the US taxpayer getting for their money? This program, PEPFAR, is billions of dollars. They want outcomes, right? How many infections have we prevented? How many lives have been saved? This policy continues to serve really as a tremendous barrier to the US implementing what we know as best practices for preventing HIV infection, and thus detrimentally affects PEPFAR program's effectiveness. So at the end of the day, those outcomes that we strive for, the various benchmarks that we have set for ourselves and that Congress has set, aren't being reached because the communities most affected aren't getting the care they needed, and the organizations that are best suited to work with sex workers and their families are not the ones getting the funds. So you can see where this really adds up to be a really harmful practice.
Absolutely. And, you know, a lot of those groups may have refused PEPFAR money and then got hit with the global gag rule.
Right. Oh my gosh, totally. Right. It's like this compounding factor upon factor of this sort of harmful US influence of these policies. So it really is, yeah, you're right, like a double whammy that we see on the ground.
Okay. So we know what it is. We know it's bad and really fighting against our stated goals of reducing HIV. So I know that there has been a big fight about it and over its constitutionality. This week is not the first time that the APLO has gone to the Supreme Court. So I guess let's talk about the first time it went to the Supreme Court. What was that case about?
Right. So, and to be clear, I'm not a lawyer, but as you say, I play one on TV, right? I know just enough to be dangerous. So I'm sure your avid listeners will sort of critique as needed. But I have been, and many of other of my friends and colleagues have been really ingrained in this battle for really over 16 years. I mean, what's crazy is...
Oh my God, that is so wild.
I know, right? I mean, when this case was first decided by the Supreme Court in 2013, which I'll talk about next, there was actually a whole backstory to that even before then, right? Obviously starting with when the law was passed in 2003, but really back to 2005 when the Alliance for Open Society International, which is my organization, first filed a challenge against the policy. So it's been that long that we have gone back and forth in the courts. And so it really is this battle that we've fought now, which to, you know, an unfortunate conclusion here this week, but something that our co-plaintiffs and that the larger global health community has fought against really across 3 different administrations, which is crazy to think about. So what I'm going to talk about is the 2013 ruling, but I'm sure there are folks out here who are really interested in kind of what was the back and forth and appeals courts and injunctions and all that. And we have a great full timeline on this website that we set up for people to really, for us to host this kind of historical knowledge of this saga at pledgechallenge.org, which I know you're going to put in the show notes, but that's helpful too for folks to kind of go back and get the background. But for the purposes of this discussion, some of you may even remember, and I was even talking to a couple staffers on Capitol Hill when this was coming up at the end of last year, and they said, well, wait, didn't the Supreme Court already rule on this? This sounds, I'm getting some deja vu. And I'm like, you're not wrong. That did happen.
And so it's weird. Both of the ones they already decided came down this week or in the same day.
Isn't that crazy? Absolutely. Yeah. Anyway. So in 2013, there was a 6-2 ruling, and so there were 8 justices because Justice Kagan recused herself from the case because she had actually been working for the government at the time, so rightfully recused herself. So 6-2 ruling, not too shabby, right? And it was in our favor. I mean, and Justice Roberts wrote the opinion, and it was a great opinion. It essentially held that the APLO violates U.S. organizations' First Amendment rights because it, quote, compels as a condition of federal funding the affirmation of a belief that by its nature cannot be confined within the scope of a government program. Okay, so that's like legal speak, but I wanted to quote it because I think it's very important. Remember when I talked about those 2 different parts of the APLO? There's a part there that actually compels an organization to say something. So that's really clearly a violation of our First Amendment right. And the court rightfully saw that and very clearly and strongly in the opinion, which you can also find on that website that I referenced. It's a good read, if you have the time. It really clearly said you absolutely cannot compel speech, again, that is outside of this piece around the government program, which in this case is PEPFAR. So we won. I mean, that was a huge victory. And leading up to oral argument, we even had numerous members of Congress, senators and representatives who had helped author the original PEPFAR legislation. We're talking about Republicans and Democrats, by the way, file amicus briefs in support of our case, saying that the way that the government was implementing the policy was in no way kind of the author's original intentions when they wrote the bill. We also had a lot of support from conservative organizations in defense of First Amendment rights. So again, it was a huge win. And we thought that it should be over. But we were wrong, obviously. We were very wrong. And that's where we get into what has led up to what happened yesterday.
Right. So, yay, good news. And then things didn't go exactly as you thought they would. So that led to round 2. So what was the fight over in this case?
Yeah, I mean, well, it started pretty immediately after the Supreme Court made their ruling, right? We go to the government, we're like, hey, you're going to change there are these things called standard provisions, okay, that sort of, when you get a award from the government to implement a program, you sort of sign all these legal things, and most of it's very benign and boring. But they have a couple policy requirements in there. Of course, if the global gag rule is enforced, that is in there, right? In this case, the anti-prostitution loyalty, and the government was sort of still putting this in the contract language, and we were kind of like, sorry, there was this ruling, and you don't get to do that. So in 2014, after really more than a year of issuing official communications regarding government funding that still contained the policy requirement with no exemption for our plaintiffs, so in this case, you have at this point Pathfinder International, Global Health Council, Interaction, and others who had joined, the government finally issued a non-binding interim guidance that sort of stated that U.S. NGOs, okay, fine, are not required to have a policy opposing prostitution. So again, let's be clear. I'm saying that the government lawyers took a year after this very clear, strong ruling to even be like, okay, you're right. U.S. NGOs, don't have to have this policy.
And that's under Obama.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, we're talking about, this is 2013. So to be clear, when I said 3 administrations, this is Bush and Obama and now Trump. I mean, God love, many of us appreciated that administration, but unfortunately, we kind of got screwed from administration, in this case, legal team, counsel, that was continuing to just really dig their heels in and not do what we interpret as the Supreme Court very clearly told them they had to do. So again, in 2014, they finally said, okay, fine, sure, you guys won. But at the same time, they also announced that the government will apply this policy requirement, or the APLO, to all foreign NGOs, including the plaintiffs' affiliates. So that's where we got into a huge issue. This is the issue now, and this is the question that was before the court this term, and that was decided Monday. We argued that when the government tries to force our clearly identified foreign affiliates that happen to be legally incorporated overseas, because, as I'll talk about, sometimes they had to be, by forcing them to abide by this policy, but of course not our U.S. entity, because again, that's unconstitutional, it forces us into what the court calls an evident hypocrisy, right? That, you're forcing us to talk out of both sides of our mouth, that the U.S. entity would never say, and is not forced to say something that you are now telling our Kenya office, right, or our Kenya affiliate, or whatever the circumstance may be, to say something in order to receive U.S. funds. That's a huge issue, and frankly, still a violation of our First Amendment rights. So a good example, I think listeners even in the domestic space will be familiar with organizations like World Vision, Save the Children, and CARE, right? These big organizations that implement U.S. government programs, on behalf of the American people that save lives, that do really good work on maternal and child health, and in this case on HIV/AIDS. In order to do work in other countries, oftentimes they have to have a legally incorporated entity in that country in order to do the work, right? Sometimes it's the local government, let's say the government of Kenya requires you to have this legal entity there. Sometimes even the U.S. government has said, hey, we really want to work with local partners. And those organizations want to hire local experts to do the work, right? That's good practice in terms of good public health. You want to hire folks from inside the community to do the work and do the programs. So we have to legally incorporate in other places. But now you're saying that you require those organizations that, by the way, have the exact same logo, right? They have the exact same color scheme. Everyone in that country knows them as Save the Children and World Vision, not some separate entity. But you're asking us to act differently. And that was the big issue, is that we said by doing that, you're really still violating our First Amendment rights. So that's really where the rubber hit the road. And that's what launched in 2014, this further back and forth. Permanent injunctions were issued and there were appeals and all that. And finally, the government essentially asked the Supreme Court to look at this last fall. And that's where we are today. We had oral arguments in March and it was decided on Monday. And so we really clearly asked the court, we weren't talking about First Amendment protections for foreign entities. We were just simply saying this is about the First Amendment rights of these American organizations. And for those out there who are more familiar with the way that global health and foreign aid implementation works, those folks I think will be very familiar with oh, well, yeah, of course you have to have these legal entities abroad. But at the end of the day, we act and speak with one voice. And so asking us to do something that is different than that is therefore a violation of our free speech rights. So sounds a little complicated, but really when you get down to it, it's quite simple.
You're all one organization, even if you have to be filed differently.
Right. From in a very technical legal standpoint, but everybody else sees us as one body, right? And OSF is a good example, right? Open Society Foundations, we're very large. We have offices all over the world, but we are one. And CARE is the same way. And Save the Children and World Vision, people don't know the difference between a World Vision Kenya and World Vision that happens to be incorporated somewhere in the U.S. They know them as this great organization that does good work, in public health and other places. So essentially, at the time of and I just want to say this, though, at the time of the prior decision, so the 2013 decision, the Supreme Court was forced on enforcement against respondents themselves. So in our case, plaintiffs, right? The court also addressed the harm to respondents that would result if the affiliate had to make a pledge. So in fact, we would argue that the court in 2013 already kind of decided this issue, but the government was able to, they thought that they had enough room to sort of bring this back to what is frankly now a much more amiable court right, to their case. So unfortunately, what happened yesterday in a 5-3 ruling, and this was the case that happened right before June Medical, right? So yesterday for me was
whiplash.
Just this total whiplash because, those of us who work on, reproductive health, reproductive rights and justice, we were watching both of these cases very closely. So it was so bizarre to have this kind of whiplash. So glad that we ended with June, right? Like kind of the happy part. But so we lost. I mean, frankly, this case was a loss for us. It was a 5-3 ruling because, again, Kagan is recused, right? And the majority went straight for what is a, frankly, quite narrow and cynical argument that the government took, which was First Amendment protections don't extend to foreign organizations or foreign entities, period. Right. Like, that's where the majority went, which, frankly, is not at all, like, what we were arguing, of course. We weren't asking for that. That would represent a dramatic expansion of First Amendment rights. That's not what we're talking about. And frankly, the sort of dissenting opinion that was led by Justice Breyer and joined by Justice Sotomayor and Ginsburg said it really well. It said, this case is not about the First Amendment rights of foreign organizations. It is about, and has always been about, the First Amendment rights of American organizations. So that is, obviously, we very much agree with that opinion and that sentiment. So it's definitely an unfortunate loss. This 16-year saga is quote unquote over. But as I think we'll talk about, it's not really, right? Like, we have other actions that we can then take.
So what is this going to mean on the ground?
Well, I think a lot of this, frankly, Jenny, goes back to kind of what we talked about earlier. The APLO has already been in place, all through this argument as it relates to foreign organizations. Even taking a step back from the question that was before us here, which was around foreign affiliates of U.S. organizations, the fact remains that this has been applied to all foreign NGOs since 2003. That's a tremendous amount of impact. We have already sort of talked about how the APLO harms our battle against HIV globally and diminishes the effectiveness of existing programs, and how the policy already sort of stigmatizes sex workers and has chilling effects beyond the policy's sort of quote unquote intended scope, right? I think what this case really means on the ground, we're going to have to see, because a lot of the organizations that I mentioned earlier that folks will be familiar with have to now think about how they deal with this, right? How do their Kenya affiliate or their Malawi affiliate, how do they decide if they're going to then, quote unquote, take the pledge? And how is the U.S. entity going to sit with that? Because it's not something that they would say, or of course would be forced to say, because again, it's unconstitutional. That's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out moving forward. But we know that the policy in and of itself is already super harmful. And this is just going to make it worse, because those who are best suited to provide these programs are not going to be the ones doing the work, right? Or if they do the work and quote unquote sign the pledge, how are they going to be able to serve those who are most in need,
And that's the important part, right? Like, this is all wonky and talking about policy, but it's about the people who need the services.
At the end of the day, that's the whole goal of PEPFAR. That's why we're spending billions of dollars. It's why Republicans and Democrats for decades now, right? Remember, PEPFAR was a Bush policy that came together across the aisle. That's why we do this work, is because we think it's worth it, and we think that it's worth spending the money because it's the right thing to do, because, making sure that people have access to care and that we defeat HIV is what we're trying to do at the end of the day. And frankly, like, this policy keeps us from getting there. I mean, many other policies also, like the global gag rule and others, also prevent us from getting there. But it's just another example, right, of these harmful U.S. policies that put aside, frankly, the violation of kind of human rights and these other like really bad things. It also like literally doesn't achieve our public health goals. Yeah, so it's sort of mind-boggling in some ways, especially when you had so many members of Congress who said in 2013, yeah, that's not what we meant. Like, we didn't want to really do that. Sorry.
What actions can listeners take? So how can this be fixed?
Yeah, so I think right now, like today, I think it's important to say and just really reiterate that the same fact is true as it was in 2013 when the Supreme Court ruled that the APLO was unconstitutional. And again, also when Congress passed the law and created PEPFAR in 2003, this policy is dangerous and should be permanently repealed, right? For all the reasons that we've talked about today. We've been talking about kind of like the nuances of who has to abide by it and who doesn't. But at the end of the day, the whole thing is bad, so we should get rid of it, period. And so one thing that people can do is there's actually only one piece of legislation currently introduced in Congress that actually repeals the APLO permanently. And that's the GLOBE Act. The GLOBE Act is a bill that represents kind of a comprehensive framework for U.S. foreign policy that is inclusive of and really responsive to LGBTQ people around the world. So it's an awesome piece of legislation that the LGBTQ and reproductive rights community came together and introduced last year. And so that's one thing you can do, right? You could call your representative or senator, unless you live in DC, and then,
Correct.
Sorry, right? And ask them to co-sponsor the legislation and or urge its consideration, right? So it's one thing that people can really do right now. And talk about how bad this policy is. And more broadly, how bad these U.S. policies are that really sort of export this harmful U.S. ideology that's anti-gender and anti-abortion, anti-sex work, right? Part of a broader movement that I know your listeners really care about. So that's H.R. 3874, which is in the House, and S. 3004 in the Senate. So you have no excuse. You could totally make a phone call today or send an email, because not a lot of people sit in offices. But really, too, Jenny, it's not just the APLO. We've mentioned this a little bit today. They're not the same, but there's a lot of similarities between the global gag rule, aka Mexico City policy, aka the Protecting Life and Foreign Assistance policy. There's a lot of interesting similarities, right? One, it's unconstitutional if it were applied to U.S. organizations, right? Two, it's contrary to public health best practices, as you all have talked about on the show. Three, it's antithetical to stated U.S. policy goals of, reducing maternal mortality and morbidity. And four, it exacerbates the impact of already vulnerable groups like sex workers and LGBTI people, right? So those similarities are there. So frankly, the global gag rule should be repealed too, right? I think if we're going to have this conversation around APLO, we can't not mention the global gag rule, right?
And there are different policies, as I saw on Twitter, some people getting them confused.
Yeah, and that was killing me yesterday. I think what's important to note is while there's all these similarities, they're different, right? The global gag rule, of course, is by executive action, but there is a bill in Congress that would permanently repeal it, right? And so that's the Global HER Act, which I know that you all have talked about on here. So that's another example, I think, of how those who are interested in trying to get these really harmful policies that frankly impact health and human rights around the world off the books, that's something that folks can really kind of do anytime, that we should continue to be sort of telling our representatives that they need to be taking these up, and that, it's something that they should be concerned about.
Perfect. I think that feels like a good place to stop. We have good actions people can take. Kiefer, thank you so much for doing this.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for having me. It was really fun. Glad I finally got to be on this awesome podcast.
Yes.
And here's to many more. You've done a great job, and appreciate this awesome service you're doing for our community.
All right, everybody. Thanks for listening. Again, hopefully I will get the June Medical Services episode up soon this week. I'm working on it. We're trying to find a time to get the interview scheduled, and the episode will be up as soon as I can get the interview done. So it's coming. And as of when I'm recording this, which is Tuesday, we are still waiting on the birth control decision. And once we have that decision, I will have Mara back on to talk about what the court decided and what that is going to mean for people trying to access birth control. So with that, in case I don't talk to you, I hope everybody has a lovely long weekend. Hopefully I will before then, but you never know. I will talk to you all soon. For more information, including show notes from this episode and previous episodes, please visit us at our website at reprosfightback.com. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at rePROs Fight That, and on Instagram at rePROs FB. If you like our show, please help others find it by sharing it with your friends, and please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. Thanks for listening.